Okay, I think it's time to start. As you can hear, I kind of lost my voice, sorry for that, so I will be brief. Two informations before letting Sarah Conley give her presentation. First, we will have tomorrow during the lunch break business meeting of the ISUS. So everybody can join. This will be in a room, in a meeting room just right there, and it will be during the lunch break. Second information, because I had a lot of questions about this, is that there will be a stream to watch the game tonight at the restaurant. So don't worry. Okay? So, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Sarah Conley for our presentation, because honestly, I think that her book, Against Autonomy, is, at least for me, one of the most provocative and challenging books I read in the last few years. So it is a great, great pleasure to welcome you. And, well, it's yours.
Hi, thank you for having me. I hope you don't regret it. As background, so I quit philosophy in 1986 for good, I thought at the time. And I didn't do philosophy professionally until again in 2006 I got a job and got back into it. And at that point I was living in the state of Maine, which is a rural state in the northeast corner of the United States. I wanted to stay there, so I got a job at a very small school, 1,800 students, in a very small department, 4 philosophers total, in a pretty small town in this rural state. And as one does, I started writing philosophy from this position of obscurity. And so at the end of 2012, I published my first book, which Malik says was Against Autonomy, now available in French, Contre l'Autonomie. And then in 2015, I published One Child, as it's called. So the first book was a book in favor of paternalistic laws. So as you all probably know, those are laws that either require you to do what is good for you, or at least make it very unattractive to do what is bad for you. And I talked about food laws, so portion control in fast food restaurants, riveting stuff like that. In the second book, I talked about whether you have a right to have more than one child in a case where that threatens real environmental damage, and I argued that it would be okay for the government to disincentivize having more than one child in certain ways, not others. So both these books argued for a kind of government interference. And I was astonished to find, especially after the first book, which, as I say, was not on what we generally think of as a life and death issue. I was astonished to find I got a lot of hate mail, mainly hate email, but some, actual paper mail. And so, I got things comparing me to Hitler, Stalin, Castro, very unpopular in the U.S., Mao Zedong, I can't, on and on. So this was very surprising to me because, really, a lot of it, so maybe not the book about children, but the first book seemed just not that exciting. And so what I found was that these people were so energized, so excited that they actually bothered to go find my email and tell me how awful I was, because they thought that this was the thin end of the wedge. So one of my emails said, "This is how Hitler started." And this was in reference to soda portion sizes, because I had published, seriously, I published an op-ed in the New York Times. And of course I'm like, no, Hitler did not start with soda, and he wasn't a paternalist, he didn't want to benefit people. But it was clear the concern these people had was that I was going to take away their liberty. Well, obviously I have no power or influence. But the very idea that someone would argue in favor of taking away even these sort of teeny tiny liberties like getting a lot of soda in one big cup instead of having to get two small cups really upset people to the point that they would, actually take the time to write me. So finally, I started to think about liberty and why people get so upset about it. And you might think this is kind of asked backwards, and maybe it is. I should have thought before, but I'm thinking now. And so my question, and I have to tell you in the early stages, is why is liberty important? Is liberty important? If it's important, when is it important? And what makes it important? And I think to some people it seems obvious that it is important. So we're in France, liberté, égalité, fraternité, printed everywhere. When I was a kid in the United States, we had to memorize the speech of Patrick Henry, which says, give me liberty or give me death. There's more, but that was the punchline. So obviously we take it seriously in some ways. But what I am starting to conclude is that although rhetorically we think it's really important, we don't actually think it's that important for its own sake. There are cases where liberty gets us something we want. We don't want to lose that, but it's not clear to me that liberty itself has much value. So, we'll see. So the paper. So I say, what would our lives be like if we had much less personal freedom than we now do? What would it be like if this were the result of a plan made by others to get us to change our ways? And what if this plan involved not only laws that governed your behavior, like no smoking or no environmentally destructive lifestyles? What if it involves attempts to change your own value system to be more consistent with socially accepted values? This is likely to happen. So we are faced with more and more in the way of government interference. We've just flown, many of us, to get here. And so when you do that, you are forcibly reminded that who gets on a plane, what documents they have, what items they can take with them, where the water had to be purchased, are matters of government control. And we know this is controlled pervasively, and it's very inconvenient. What we eat and drink is largely controlled. We don't have portion sizes, but many substances are banned from sale. Most are subject to inspection. Many are taxed in ways that means they may be prohibitively expensive. Our cars and houses must pass inspection to be sold. We must pass tests to be allowed to drive. We need licenses to work in many jobs, and for that matter, to get married. Furthermore, to enable this control, governments must engage in a great deal of what might be called incursions into privacy. Before we board the plane, our luggage and our bodies are subject to scans and searches. Our speed on the road is monitored, sometimes from above, as the signs say. Our behavior on the sidewalks is recorded by CCTV cameras, whose evidence can be collected and used against us. Those particular forays into privacy are transparent. That is, we know that they occur. But sometimes we learn that there are further investigations that we as individuals had not known about. So like the collection of our phone data in the US by a secretive security agency, the NSA. And in other cases, apparently there is surveillance by drones, of which we are unaware. The government furthermore attempts to affect us by teaching us values. In some cases, some governments, the value of nationalism and intolerance. In some cases, the values of cosmopolitanism and tolerance. While many governments publicly endorse policies of liberal pluralism, in fact, we know that even these governments promote some values and discourage others. And as many have pointed out, liberal pluralism is itself an expression of value. Such endorsements of value are not coercive. The government could only with great difficulty actually force us to believe that a given thing is good or bad. Still, we are influenced by the opinions we hear, especially if we think the opinion expressed is indicative of a shared belief by those around us. If past history is any indication, the number of regulations and methods of interference will only increase in the future. Many people regret this. Such interferences are seen as an attack on personal liberty, and most people view personal liberty as intrinsically good in itself. While many people would concede that it is permissible at times to deprive people of some aspect of their liberty so that we may attain a greater good, such losses are still regarded as true losses, whatever the gains may be. The belief is that when we lose liberty, we lose a valuable and valued thing, no matter what good may be attained in its stead. And I agree. Many of these losses of liberty are to be regretted. I think, though, that when we are judging losses of liberty, we should consider two things. First, such losses are inevitable. While some people speak of humans as naturally free beings who are distorted by the loss of liberty involved in being governed, they can be correct only if we construe liberty or freedom very narrowly. If freedom consists, as Hillel Steiner once wrote, in being able to do what we want to do, our natural state is one of unfreedom. We are always constrained, always subject to things that prevent us from doing what we might like to have done. In the first place, of course, we are prevented by natural circumstances. We are prevented from enjoying leisure by the need to go find food. While it is thought by some that constraints arising from impersonal circumstances are morally neutral, since they don't involve domination by other agents, it is good to bear in mind that these are real problems when it comes to doing what we want to do. And indeed, such natural constraints, as we will see later, are one thing that drive us to seek out human society. Second, we are constrained by the existence of other people, even without the existence of government. Sometimes these other people intend to interfere with our freedom, as when the bandit demands our money or our life. But of course, sometimes they do not. When I am stuck in traffic and unable to get where I want to go, it's not because anyone intended for there to be a traffic jam. Probably everyone involved wishes there were no traffic jam. Still, by their presence, they prevent me from doing what I want, in more palpable ways than the existence of a government-imposed speed limit, a limit I am in no danger of passing when I am surrounded by crowds of other non-governmental agents, all trying to get home at the same time I am. So we typically live in situations where we are constrained, often and in significant ways, from doing what we want, even if we exist in some pre-governmental or extra-governmental state. When we create government with its multiple forms of interference, we generally substitute one form of intervention for another. And the overall degree of intervention we suffer may be less when there is government interference, say traffic regulations that reduce traffic jams, than when there is no such regulation. Obviously, many people do not agree with this assessment. The idea articulated often is that we should have as little government as necessary, and that each intervention by government should be regarded as a prima facie bad thing, even if it is justified sometimes, all things considered. Of course, to say we should have as little government as necessary is not in itself much of a normative statement. If it simply means that we should have no more government than we need to accomplish our goals, well, this is straightforward and uncontroversial. After all, we might truthfully say we should have no more ice cream than we need to accomplish our goals. What would be the point of producing ice cream that will simply lie around melting? It would be a waste of resources and labor and messy to clean up. The argument against government, however, is not simply that we shouldn't spend time creating something we don't need. It's rather that government itself is in itself somehow a disvalue. It's bad, and can be justified only insofar as it is required to prevent great evils. Even if a lack of liberty might increase our happiness, many people would say that a loss of liberty needed to bring about that increase of happiness would be unjustified. For example, while people do not object to police actions designed to arrest criminals after the fact, how far government should go to prevent attacks in the first place is a matter of controversy. In the United States, many people object to the idea that people should need licenses to own guns, even when that would be designed to protect the innocent from attacks by wrongdoers. In Europe, gun control is not so controversial. But there are still questions as to how far government should go to prevent crime. No one that I know of approves of surveillance in homes to prevent people from committing crimes because it's a violation of privacy. Few seem to approve of stopping people as they walk down the street to see if they are armed. Although at this time, we are more willing to do that when it comes to people who are entering public spaces like stadiums. So we find ourselves unwilling generally to let the government do everything that might be required to prevent, say, gun violence, even though we deplore gun violence. So the question is, what is so bad about government intervention? Obviously, it can be bad. Interventions can come from an oppressive government whose rules are intended to harm. Those that object to infringements upon liberty do not limit their objections to places like North Korea, though. The question is what is to be regretted about interventions that arise from a democratic government, which are intended to benefit the population as a whole, and which succeed in doing that. Why should we object to such interference? There are obvious inconveniences if we are randomly stopped and searched. Surveillance in the home would be intimidating. We might be afraid to sing out loud if we have bad voices. We might be worried if we engage in long conversations with our dog, as I do a lot. But for many people, the danger of government intervention or surveillance is not simply that it might be practically inconvenient or it might inhibit embarrassing behavior. Rather, the objection is one of principle. Government intervention interferes with our liberty, with our autonomy, and this is a bad thing in itself. Justified, when it is justified, only by prevention of the most grievous harm, and in some cases, not justifiable at all. So the question again is why this is so. As discussed above, interference in our actions arises from many sources, and sometimes government interference is the only way to prevent interference by society outside government. So why object to it? Why do some people consider themselves free if they are free of government interference, even when they are inevitably affected in their choices by the actions taken by individuals outside government? Okay. One may think that government interference in one's actions is fundamentally unlike the interference that arises just from general society in a number of ways. One, some people argue government is a system of domination. Some thinkers, like Robert Nozick, have said the significant issue when it comes to liberty is the dominance of one person's will by another. You will to do something, and another person wills that you do not do that thing, and the other person's will predominates. You don't do that thing, either because you are literally prevented from doing it, or because the other person's will made doing that thing too costly. The government might ban cigarettes to prevent you from smoking, or it might tax cigarettes to the point where they are very hard to afford. In the second case, they don't absolutely prevent you from buying cigarettes, but they make it so difficult that you don't buy them. Whether the regulation is a ban or simply a disincentive, it may be equally coercive. Well, it is true, of course, that government dominates. It does other things, too, like tell us what the weather will be or post buoys as channel markers. But much of its activity is geared towards making us do stuff, whether or not we want to do it. But accepting that government dominates the individual, and accepting for purposes of argument that domination of some others is in itself a bad thing, doesn't entail that government is worse than the absence of government. We are dominated by others in many ways when we interact, and this seems unavoidable, unless we live in isolation, something that will be addressed later. In the most obvious case, we are dominated by violent wrongdoers if we have no government to prevent that. Thieves take our property against our will. Evil people assault our bodies. More generally, though, we see any number of dominating relationships that have nothing to do with government power. So profiteers may sell us defective products without the protection of government inspection, or may engage in fraud. Advertisers may prey upon our cognitive biases and persuade us to buy things that are harmful to ourselves and not even particularly enjoyable. Some groups may dominate other groups by refusing to hire those in the less powerful groups, or by systematically paying them money when there is no government regulation against that. In some cases, such differential treatment may be intended as a method of domination, and in others it may not. It may simply have come to be an accepted social standard, say, that women should not be hired for construction jobs, without anyone believing that the goal is domination, but it results in domination nonetheless. Those who complain about the domination of government may be themselves those who are not so prone to being socially dominated. There is no doubt, though, that domination of some individuals by others is a constant possibility. And for many who tend to be socially dominated, government is the best protection. In the end, I think maybe when Nozick writes about domination and why we hate it, he's confusing issues of domination with issues of status. So status refers to your ranking in society. Whatever it's based on. Some people have a higher ranking, have higher status. And we care about status. And that concern may be hardwired. It may be evolutionary. We know primates, gorillas, care about status. Other animals care about status. There's a top-ranked male, sometimes more diffused rankings. And this plays an evolutionary role. Those with higher status find it easier to procreate, easier to get the stuff they need to survive. So that is an issue. But domination by itself doesn't entail that someone has a higher status than we do. For that matter, having a higher status doesn't entail domination. So, for example, consider soccer, or football, as the English incorrectly say. So, since we've been playing or watching soccer, during the game, the referee dominates. That is, the referee enforces the rules. Somebody else, FIFA, I guess, makes the rules, so they really dominate. But in the short run, the referee enforces the rules. The referee has the power of sanction. He can give out a yellow card, a red card, whatever, call the ball in, call the ball out, goal kick, corner kick, all up to the referee. So that's dominance. Ronaldo wishes that he got a call for a foul and the ref says no, that Ronaldo's will is dominated by the ref. But it's not a status distinction. When it comes to soccer, I'd say typically the players have more status than the referee, socially speaking. They're the ones we care about. They're the ones we admire. If the ref could be a player, I'm sure he would, even though he'd have to give up his dominance as a ref. There's no status involved in the ref's domination. If a player wanted to become a ref, presumably he can do that. I guess some do. So that sort of dominance doesn't send a message that we are somehow an underclass. That's something we object to, but dominance by itself doesn't entail that. Same with government, at least in theory. In a properly functioning democratic government, domination within an institution is not a function of a general social status. It doesn't establish a status. Sometimes in the real world, of course, it does. So in the US, you want to have an important political office, you have to be rich. But that's not a function of how government has to work. So if we remember that, I think we may say, okay, domination by itself, which, government does do, is not necessarily such a problem. Okay, second complaint against government. Government is impersonal. We often hear the complaint that government is impersonal and that it fails to treat citizens as distinct individuals. And also, when we deal with government, we often cannot find a person, an identifiable person, with whom we may interact. We are all used to getting form letters in regards to some policy where there's no signature, no attention to our circumstances, and no indication of who you might call up to complain about this. If you do call, you can try that. Sometimes they'll say, we have no idea what you're talking about. That's happened to me. But if they do, they just read you what the letter already said. There's no accountability. So that's a pain. Government brings bureaucracy, and bureaucracy brings with it a wealth of regulations. At best, the idea behind such regulation is to avoid corruption. The more individual government workers are given latitude to make decisions and to form personal relationships with those with whom they interact, the more liable they may be to making decisions that are biased, either by something straightforward like a bribe, or just by their own prejudicial beliefs about the people with whom they interact. To bypass the flaws of individual decision-making, we see regulations that require more and more justificatory documentation. The regulatory paraphernalia of institutions, where that institution trusts no one to make a decision that isn't according to a written rule, does become more and more unwieldy and oppressive. Since such Byzantine requirements baffle most citizens, it is not unnatural that they feel they have to meet impossibly obscure requirements imposed by an indifferent bureaucracy where there's really no one in charge. So there are two answers to this criticism. The first, governments can do better or worse in avoiding bureaucracy. It is always difficult to reconcile the demands of efficiency against the demands of fairness when you're trying to allocate goods over a very large number of people. But governments could at least be more or less responsive when an inefficiency is discovered. Some of this is a function of willingness to accept criticism, and that may vary with how much individual government officials think their positions are imperiled by the acceptance of criticism. So it is true, though, bureaucracy, with all that it implies, is impossible to avoid when we're talking about national governments that are dealing with tens or hundreds of millions of citizens. Again, though, the question is whether this is worse than the helplessness we may experience vis-a-vis society outside of government. We're aware of our helplessness when we're faced with bureaucracies, since we may be literally trying to fill out incomprehensible paperwork in order to get health coverage or a license to work or just to pay taxes, which they want you to do, and yet you still can't figure out how to do it, in my case. So we naturally feel frustration when there are steps we have to take to get what we want and deserve, and more frustration when there seems to be unnecessary confusion and delay, and even more frustration if, in the end, we are actually denied what we believe we are due. Frustration of our desires is unpleasant and may furthermore make us feel helpless and disempowered. In some cases, then, the interventions brought by non-governmental social actions may feel less irritating. We are often not aware of the ways in which society interferes with the achievement of our desires, and to that extent, we don't resent it. Indeed, we may adjust our desires to such social circumstances. without reflecting on the fact that social practices could be differently construed. For example, people responded with great indignation to China's one-child regulation, a policy instigated and enforced by the government. At the same time, many people adjust the number of children they will have because of non-governmental social circumstances. In the United States, where university education is extremely expensive, in private universities often about $60,000 per year for 4 years, so $240,000, people adjust the number of children they have in light of what they can afford for education. And people, you think about that. How many kids can I put through college? You know, a half or something. In other cases, people adjust the number of children they have so they themselves can earn more money at work. By and large, those adjustments have not caused the same amount of resentment as the Chinese one-child policy, as they are somehow seen as natural and inevitable. In the United States, where until recently many people were unable to afford health insurance, the lack of health insurance was not seen as an unnecessary interference by others in one's desire to be healthy. The common attitude was, that's the way it is. People who want health insurance should work harder so they can find a job that provides health insurance. Failing that, it's natural that you have no health care. The concatenation of social circumstances that brought about a system where only the well-off could get good health care was so abstruse and at the same time so familiar, it really wasn't noticed. Given this, people didn't generally feel that others were frustrating them in their pursuit of good health. Once the government mandated that people acquire health insurance, that being the only way to cover health costs in the U.S., many people objected, and they continue to object. Their freedom is being taken away from them. It is. But even more freedom was taken away from them by the social conventions that prevented them from having health coverage. And you might say that's just the United States, everyone's crazy. But other places too respond this way. So, Brexit, one complaint in Britain was, it's about control by Europeans. Why? Just because it's bad or something. So it's not just the United States. So we know non-governmental social institutions can be more unresponsive to the plight of the individual than can government institutions, and can allow for just as great a sort of anonymity amongst those who make the policies, since they themselves, making the policies, don't even realize they're instantiating an inhumane system. So the first argument against government was that it was dominating, and I said not really more than other institutions, and anyway, domination per se isn't so bad. Second argument was it's an unwieldy bureaucracy and makes it impossible to act, and I argued same thing outside of government. Here, three. Last argument against government is that it is pervasive and powerful. It's true. Government is self-conscious. That is, those who are in it are aware of their position as officials, and they are aware of their interrelationship with other government institutions. They have a means of communication and resources for imposing the government's will. So if the government sets out to implement a policy, that policy can be effected more quickly and effectively than many non-governmental persons can effect a change, even where there's a popular movement to, say, be vegetarian or environmentally sensitive. Significantly, of course, governments have police and military at their disposal, and those can actually hurt people. So those things are true. I've been looking at problems we might find in government infringements in liberty, even when governments are democratic and well disposed towards its citizens. But obviously not all governments are so disposed. So there's always a danger that a good government could go bad. and that they may use their powers of coercion against individuals or a large part of the population, and that, in fact, is bad. They can furthermore try to teach us values to cement their power. Often these values, when government teaches values, they're values that seem unambiguously good to most of us, like don't be violent. But it's always possible that a government might choose to teach values that are geared to solidifying its own power, as again with North Korea. So that's very dangerous. As we have seen, there have also been great non-governmental pressures on us that harm us. Pressures to be racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and so forth. But since the government has the power to control the means of public communication and the power to find and root out opponents of its views, the idea that government should attempt to control our ideas and our actions is particularly worrying. This is of great concern. Governments might do harm in at least two ways. A benevolent, beneficent, participatory government may just make mistakes. Bad policies get adopted, policies that do more harm than good. And often when a bad policy is adopted, it becomes entrenched and takes longer to overturn than it should. Cass Sunstein, who argued for libertarian paternalism, not just paternalism, argued for the libertarian part for that reason. He said nudges should not eliminate options. All the options should remain there. They should just make it harder to access those options, but they shouldn't be coercive. Because government might make a mistake and have a bad policy, and so we need to be able to do what, in fact, we truly want to be. So government might make a more or less innocent mistake, or of course you might have governments that are just bad, that are trying to cement their own power over the power of the citizens. But this doesn't suggest we should count any and every infringement of liberty through regulation to constitute a significant loss. This means we should be on the alert for government attempts to take steps towards amassing its own power in ways that would insulate it from criticism and reform. We can't assume that government actions are benevolent or intended to safeguard democracy. At the same time, though, we can't assume that government actions that limit liberty always presage an attempt at a totalitarian takeover. Lumping all government regulations together as dangerous dictatorial actions is as lazy as lumping them all together as benevolent actions that need not be examined. If we decide what to do solely by looking at the worst-case analysis, we will find ourselves unable to do anything. We may consider what would happen if the policy were abused, but we also need to consider how likely it is to be abused, and how likely it is, on the other hand, to be beneficial. So if this is true, why do people get so upset when they lose liberties to government, assuming the government is benign and democratic? I mean, for the same reason they ought to value it. When a government imposes a regulation, people have it vividly before them that that could be different. So you know that it used to be okay to drive without a seatbelt, now you have to wear a seatbelt. When we're aware of a new regulation, we're aware that it could be otherwise. And we think very forcibly what life was like before the regulation came. This is presumably part of why people object to new regulations much more than to those that have been in place for a while. For when it's a new regulation, we can really vividly imagine a world without the regulation. But the fact that we're aware of government regulation gives us ways to change regulations when they are bad regulations. We often don't notice non-governmental standards that regulate our behavior because we're used to them. We don't stop and wonder why the mother always does the cooking, like when I was a kid. Never crossed my mind. We do notice government regulation and subject it to critical scrutiny. So while this means we object to it, it actually means it is a safer kind of regulation. Now, one may ask whether human society is just bad. You might say that rather than showing that the interference in personal choice that governments engage in is not objectionable in itself, I have simply shown that society with other human beings presents us with nothing but morally objectionable alternatives. Either we are subject to social pressures, intentional and unintentional, of other human beings who are not organized in a government, or we are subject to pressures that come from a government, and they're both bad. The ideal would be to live independent of other humans, and it is our sorry modern state, surrounded by others, that is to be deplored. Some people think this way, and a few people actually act to remove themselves from society as far as possible. But the life of a hermit has its own problems. Most people who try to live off the grid, for example, don't really try to live entirely without the products of society. They order things through the mail. They order seeds, they order books, they order parts for their tractor. This is because truly living without other people brings its own set of overwhelming hardships. Most of us would be hungry and cold. In fact, most of us would simply be dead. We wouldn't be able to get the things that we want, including leisure and amusement. We'd be prevented from living the way we want. Some philosophers have argued that natural infringements on choice don't count as a loss of liberty because they are instead mere inabilities. So French political theorist Helvetius famously claimed that it is not a lack of freedom not to fly like an eagle or swim like a whale, arguing there is an absence of freedom only when we are infringed upon by other people. Isaiah Berlin endorsed this idea in his Two Concepts of Liberty, when he outlined what should count as an infringement on negative liberty, and said merely being unable to do what one wants because of impersonal circumstances does not constitute a lack of liberty. If one chooses, one may stipulate that liberty or freedom are terms that should be used relative only to other people. But we should not infer from these that those are the only lacks that matter to us. The natural lacks we would suffer outside of society would prevent us from living the way we want to live. Perhaps we should turn the line of thinking that says natural abilities are not to be morally deplored on its head, and say that we are simply naturally unable to live without humans, and with the social pressure that entails. We need the cooperation of others to live as we want, even though that ends up being a compromise, giving up some other things we want for the sake of things we want more. But this is not a moral outrage. It's just the nature of human beings whose desires range more widely than their abilities. Such beings will need social interaction and cooperation to achieve what they want. We can deplore unnecessary losses of liberty when they take away something we want while give us nothing in return, but losses of liberty per se are simply unavoidable given the way we are constituted. So, I think we need to weigh different losses of liberty against one another and decide which have worse outcomes. It may be objected that in following this line of argument, I am treating liberty as a means to an end, rather than an end in itself, as something merely instrumentally valuable, rather than something intrinsically valuable. Of course, liberty, like other things, may be both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable, but if liberty is only valuable instrumentally, only valuable because it brings us other goods, then it is, in principle, something we could do without. That is, if it is only instrumentally valuable, it is in principle possible that something else could bring us that good thing so that the liberty in question could be replaced by some other means to that end. So, for example, I go to the dentist as a means to an end, having better teeth. If I could achieve that end without going to the dentist, I would give up going to the dentist and I would lose nothing. So if, on the other hand, liberty is intrinsically valuable, that means that when we lose liberty, we lose a good, no matter what we get in its stead. It is true that even if liberty is intrinsically good, this good may be outweighed by other intrinsic goods. Can happen sometimes. But in that case, we've still lost something that was itself a good, even if we have gained something in exchange. If, on the other hand, liberty is simply a means to something else that is valuable, then in losing it, we lose nothing. So this is a difficult issue. It's notoriously hard to show what things have intrinsic value and what things are only instrumentally valuable. Looking at our own behavior is something of a guide. If, when we have something, we seem satisfied, rather than using that thing as a means to something else, that is some evidence that we value it for its own sake. This is not a definitive guide to intrinsic value, however. Looking at what we pursue for its own sake may still leave us confused. It is notoriously true of money that while its value seems to lie in what it can get us, food or shelter or status, some people come to want it for its own sake and to amass more sum than could be seemingly be useful for meeting any other need. In such a case, we tend to think that their behavior is not a good guide to what is intrinsically valuable. We think they become confused and are treating a mere means as an end because they have forgotten, in a sense, why it was that they valued money in the first place. So, whether liberty is valuable for its own sake or valuable as a means to an end is not a question that will be resolved within this paper. I think, though, for what it is worth, it makes sense to value liberty differently according to what it gets us. And you might think, well, of course you feel that way. You're a utilitarian. Utilitarians don't value anything except pleasure, so you're willing to toss it out. But that's not the argument. One, I think even if you are not a utilitarian and not a consequentialist, you could very well accept that sometimes that liberty really is itself something merely useful as a means. Two, if you are a consequentialist, of course some consequentialists seem to think liberty is intrinsically valuable. They may think that it's valuable as a constituent means to welfare. That is, on certain views of human welfare, it's like freedom has to be included amongst the things you have to really be well off. So it's not just, utilitarians, whatever, they have a sense of value. And indeed, even amongst those who are utilitarian and who might think of liberty as a means, a lot of them are going to think of it as such an important means that it can never be removed. And Mill might be in that category, or he might be in the category that thinks it's necessary for welfare as an intrinsic good. I don't know. But the question, though, remains. So, it seems to me, when respecting personal liberty gives us the ability to choose to eat things that are unhealthy, it's not important. When respecting personal liberty protects us from being hauled off to prison without trial, it is important. I think, furthermore, that these distinctions are reflected in our attitude to losses of liberty, even when that is not what our rhetoric expresses. As I say, when a new regulation threatens to force us to wear seatbelts, many people object. But often the objection is along the lines of, well, what next will happen? They see it as the beginning of a progression towards Hitler. So the objection is not so much to the fact we are coerced into wearing seatbelts, but that this might lead to a more significant loss of liberty. Then, when the regulation proves to be effective, saving lives, and not too costly, and doesn't lead to a totalitarian takeover, then we go, okay, the seatbelt law is a good law. So the contemporaries, when it's first introduced, tend to react against it, but then the next generation is like, obviously, we should wear seatbelts, duh. So even when the liberty that's taken away is an important one, we don't seem to object if we're convinced that we need to give that liberty up in order to obtain important ends. After terrorist attacks, we are willing to allow increased surveillance and intrusive police activities that we would have previously objected to, if we think they're actually effective. So, I think probably we treat liberty as a means to an end. It is likely, of course, that even if liberty is valuable only as a means to an end, it is in some cases something we cannot do without. While merely instrumental valuable things are replaceable in principle, in this world, it may be that we have no other way to obtain the goods liberty provides. It may be the possession of liberty is the only means to certain ends we hold dear. In that case, even though in principle we might do without liberty, in practice it would still be necessary to our attaining valuable ends. So that's what I think. In some cases, liberty is an indispensable good, even if it is a good because of what it brings us. But it's good to bear in mind that not all liberties are like this. It's a mistake to think that any deprivation of liberty undercuts our agency and self-respect. The liberty to eat trans fats, for example, simply is not significant. Neither is the liberty to drink very large sodas in one very large cup, as New York's Mayor Bloomberg tried to prevent. The liberty to vote and to run for office and to criticize the government are very different things. They're important. And I can't imagine myself any other way to secure the goods they bring than to allow such liberties to remain undiminished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have time for questions.
Thank you very much for the paper, especially in the first part in which you said many times that after all, without the government, we would have less liberty than with the government. It seems that the government is not doing any particular work or any specific work different from any association or any instrument of social cooperation. So there are stories saying that obviously a good market could do what the government is doing, or a good association could do. So I wonder whether you have which kind of conception of the government you have.
I guess I do think of the government as something that has explicit powers of sanction. I do think of the government as something that does have powers of sanction and control, more even than a market. I also do not think the market is a very successful way of, I think it's oppressive in itself in probably worse ways than the government. So I think it might be the case in some ways that there are organizations other than government that are helpful, so that's good, but I don't think they eliminate the need for government. In fact, I would like the government to boss the markets, for example, more than it does.
Other questions? Sorry.
I don't need a microphone.
translators. They can't hear.
Okay, I have a question. Who decides what we have to keep and what we don't need to keep?
In terms of liberty?
Yeah. Is it objective or is it subjective? I mean,
Well, insofar as we are deciding it, I suppose it's a subjective decision. That is, I think it operates like all government regulations. You've got people making regulations, you've got other people objecting to those regulations, you have some interplay between them. And then again, you know, we find sometimes that a rule comes and we don't like it, and then we get to like it. Other times there's a rule, and as time goes by, the stupider it seems, and we object. And they do get entrenched, but ideally, and sometimes for real, then they get removed again. So it's a cooperative decision. I don't see what else it could be.
Thanks for the talk. I'm sympathetic. A lot of the talks seem to be about how much we value liberty, but the particular extra conclusion that you want is that it's instrumentally valuable, which I'm also sympathetic to. So I'll give you the argument that I face when I impose that, which is just the classic kind of two world arguments type cases where you have, you know, a particular society with a certain amount of welfare, and then you have another one with the exact same amount of welfare, but the added bonus of liberty. Is it at least a tiebreaker somehow instrumentally?
Mm-hmm.
Would you want to bite the bullet on those kind of cases and claim they're equally of value?
Well, probably. I mean, I think our intuitions are affected because we are thinking that the society without liberty will not retain the amount of welfare it has. That is, bad things will start to happen and we'll have no way of fighting against that. But barring that, so some people, for example, believe in God and that God has all power and sanctions you and he makes rules and can affect what you do, and that doesn't seem to bother them because it's God. So it's okay, you know. They don't say, but I need liberty. They say, well, you know, it's God. It's not really going to go wrong. We're all set. That's not my belief, but it's analogous. You know, if you were really sure that it couldn't go wrong, then I don't really see a problem. And then, you know, when you have liberty, the problem is you often do screw up. You know, you choose things that are bad for you, and things get muddled, and it, you know, thanks a lot. You know, it wasn't much of a help. So.
Thanks.
Thank you for a lively talk, and I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. My question is that okay, government has one thing that natural things or natural intrusion doesn't have. That is political authority. I think that is if government prevents someone from doing something, it's said simultaneously that that is illegitimate or something, and it has certain kind of authority to somehow say that, and it is respected in the society, I think. And so when I'm prohibited by the government from not wearing my seatbelt, then I'm kind of if I have the view that it's okay to have not to have a seatbelt on, my view is denied, and some kind of legitimacy, the authority tells me that your view is mistaken, and you are doing something illegitimate or something like that. That is annoying. I mean, so natural prevention. That is, if big guy comes to my car and somehow forcefully put my seatbelt on, that doesn't tell me anything about legitimacy. But if government does it, it's communicate something about legitimacy in the authority, that seems to be annoying and maybe troublesome aspect of liberty. I'm not sure I can communicate you well.
No, I think you were right. So the government claims authority that the bad guy with the gun does not. I mean, he's got force, but the bandit doesn't have authority. And the government says, we have authority.
Yeah.
I think I'm okay with that because often I think the government does have authority.
Yeah.
That is, it depends on the government. But I think there are many cases where, we vote, we get together, we need a referee, we make him the referee, that is the government. And then if that referee comes and says, you have to wear a seatbelt, well, yeah, this is what we voted for. So some people find it disrespectful. Because if a bandit tries to take your money, he doesn't necessarily disrespect you. You're just in opposition. You're two equal people. You're fighting over who gets the money. The government says, we know better than you do. And that is irritating. But I guess I often find, I hate to say this, the government does know better than I do. So when it comes to food additives, for example, the government says you can include this and you can't include that, and different governments, have different decisions. I mean, they know more about food additives than I do, and more than I want to. I mean, the last thing I want to do is go out and study up on food additives. So I think it's authoritative because we've given them this power. Sometimes they are correct, sometimes they're not correct, of course. And you're right, even in that case, they have authority because even though they've made an incorrect decision, we've given them this power. But I guess I don't think you should be irritated. I think it's like, yeah, this is what we get. It's either the government regulation or me with this huge crowd of people in the traffic jam, and they don't have authority, but my life is just as bad.
Right. But we are talking about paternalistic action of the government, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So the presumption is that the guy who is intervened on knows better than government, I think, because it is about his own things, right? I mean, if that's the presumption, and then the government intrudes on you, that seems to be that he or she has prima facie ground to say, hey, you somehow deny this presumption and you think it's better, I mean, you think that you are better than me or something, and that seems to be disrespectful for somebody to say so. Yeah.
Well, I think in many cases we cannot make the presumption that the individual knows best what he should do. In some cases, but in a lot of cases, no, because the individual is uninformed, for example. So people, I know people who don't wear their seatbelt because they think they will be able to jump from the car if there is an accident, seriously. And it's like, no. They are uninformed. There might be a case, of course, you might be an unusual person where you just really would rather die from hitting the windshield than wear a seatbelt. And in that case, you're right, the government is making you do something that isn't really in your interest. But I think for most of us, when we fail to wear a seatbelt because it's uncomfortable, it's because we haven't really understood how likely it is that we will be truly harmed if we don't wear the seatbelt. We're just not thinking clearly. And the government does know better.
Better about majority of the cases, sure, but not just about the small cases you mentioned, right?
Not in every case.
That seems to be kind of problematic. Yeah.
I think it's true. It's not true in every case that the government knows better. But if you are governing a country of, say, 300 million people, it's hard to cater the law to each individual person. So you just have to go with what seems to work for most people. And you would rather go through the windshield than wear a seatbelt. I guess in that case, don't wear the seatbelt. You're not going to be worried by getting a ticket from a policeman if you're willing to go through a windshield. So that is your option. But yeah, the government has to do what is generally best for people until we get maybe a better technology where we could make individual laws for each individual.
Sarah?
Ah,
Yeah, I told you to ask a question. But, I mean, that was great, I loved it. And when you're talking in many ways about current versions of government, but if one considers Bentham's utopia for a second, you could imagine a government that in a sense confers liberty because it says everything that's not socially mischievous is permitted, and everything that's socially mischievous is a frustration of expectations. Therefore, let transactions occur in all kinds of ways that the government is going to predict, but nonetheless guarantees.
well, I think when we should have liberty and when we shouldn't is an empirical question. So there might be a utopia that works like that, and maybe it would be great. I doubt it, but if it turns out to be that way, yeah. So I'm not following the objection.
It's not an objection, I'm just saying that in a sense, all I'm saying is that in a sense your argument is sort of based on government as we experience it at the moment, which isn't Bentham's utopia. I'm just saying that in a sense, there's a different way of looking at liberty as something that can, as it were, be conferred by security. If the government says, well, we confer security by guaranteeing absence of mischief, then in a sense that liberates freedom of transaction insofar as it does not.
Well, if you could do that, yeah. I mean, I'm open-minded about what should be the best form, but somewhat pessimistic about people's ability to avoid mischief. But
Okay, I have a very basic and probably unphilosophical question to ask. I understand that for some in the US, your arguments might sound provocative, but as a European and French citizen, I'm quite familiar with this type of reasoning. So could you tell us more about the reception that your book got, or books got in Europe?
I don't know as much about it, actually. I think some of the question is where you draw the line. That is, some of the things that Americans object to, Europeans take for granted. But then there are other things that Europeans would object to in terms of having liberty taken away. So as I say, surveillance in homes or something like that. And yeah, the only thing I can say about European reception is some people who have lived under oppressive governments feel much more strongly about liberty, saying that, it is intrinsically valuable, well, both instrumentally and intrinsically valuable. And they'll say, I've seen, what it's like not to have it, and it's a miserable existence. So that might be Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. But even Western Europe, there are going to be questions about what is allowed, what sort of clothes are you allowed to wear, do you have to take off your veil for your driver's license and things like that? Can you wear religious paraphernalia? Those are questions that get controversial even in France.
Sarah, first of all, love your talk. I'm right here.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Clear and learned and all. But I want to just throw out a coin with two sides, and I think maybe in a comment you made to someone's paper, some of it came out, but it's this. Part of would you address, say, Mill's argument for the intrinsic value of liberty because the individual is making his or her own choices, and in that decision making is education and growth and autonomy, all these things that we value. But the other point that I've heard you make, and it's worth making, is that perhaps there's something educational when, in other words, what do I know about trans fats?
Right.
Nothing. But now that I know that it's banned here and here and here, there's something educational for me. Thank you for that piece of helpful information. I'll now avoid it and go out of my way to avoid it. And similarly with, soda pop. Those drinks are really unhealthy. They're really just terrible for you. But until that was sort of hammered into my consciousness by Mayor Bloomberg and others, I wouldn't have thought about it. So there's something educational, both in thinking for yourself in resisting paternalism, you know, that's, say, the Millian argument, but there's something very educational when an authority, which we assume is benevolent, as in a democratically elected government, maybe that's not the right assumption, but we assume that it's legitimate enough to consider, is educational. So maybe there's a intrinsic value to listening to authority.
Yeah, I think Mill was very optimistic about what people would do when left to their own devices. You know, he thought that they would think about what they truly want and what the options are and would get all the information, and this would hone their ability to make decisions. You know, I think a lot of people just kind of lie on a sofa and drink soda because it's sweet, and they don't really want to take the time to see, you know, what exactly is involved in ingesting that much sugar. I mean, I don't either, for that matter, want to think about that. So, yeah, I think for a lot of us, you know, what brings our attention to certain issues is only the intervention of the government. And then you go, oh, you know, suddenly New York has started to worry about flooding from global warming. And now people in New York are like, oh, this is a serious problem because, you know, Fifth Avenue could be underwater. It brings your attention to things that otherwise you would just not bother with.
Hey, thank you, Sarah, for your talk. Yeah.
Sorry.
I would like to ask you if you don't think it's really dangerous when it's the same persons that have the power and an high status in the society. For example, I'm thinking of white heterosexual male with money and education, or for example a doctor in a psychiatric institute. I mean, these doctors, they have the power and the status, and we often suppose that the patients, they don't know nothing about their own disease, and I think there is danger when the status and the power, I mean, they meet. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think you're completely right, and that's a real danger. So I think in principle, you could have government without status, as you can have domination without status. But I admit, in actual fact, so in the US, for example, as I said, you can't possibly become a senator unless you have millions of dollars to begin with. I mean, it's not an option. You know, maybe you could be in the House of Representatives, but you know, for most things you have to have millions of dollars. So there, you obviously have a class that then can use government to protect their own interests, that is the interests of the rich, and typically rich and male. So yeah, I mean, that in the real world, that is a real problem. I guess I have this hope that you might have a democracy that actually was accessible to people generally, as opposed to requiring that you be of a certain sex, race, national, birthplace, or financial status. Maybe it's not, in which case, yeah, then the government's always going to be dangerous.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting. So you've talked a lot about cases of government paternalism, right? Cases in which the government might limit liberty in order to advance the interests of the very people whose liberty is limited. I'm wondering if you think that there's maybe a different basis for complaint, or if you're as happy with some other cases in which the government might limit the liberty of some, or impinge on the liberty of some for the benefit of others, right? So, I mean, take a different kind of healthcare case, right? You know, so there aren't enough doctors in rural Mississippi. People in rural Mississippi don't have access to even minimum quality healthcare in some cases. Well, one thing the government might do is just kind of adopt something like a compulsory service requirement, or even just like force more people to go to medical school. Maybe that would sort of,
allow them, they're kept out by the AMA.
Well,
but, okay.
so yeah, well, imagining
Okay.
a different sort of system, but we can imagine that this would benefit the people who lack health care more than it would detract from the interests of the people whose liberty is impinged on. Is that something that you'd be sort of happy with, or do the people whose liberty would be limited have a different kind of objection than is available in cases of paternalism?
Well, I think it could be okay. I mean, you want to remember that for a utilitarian, a policy isn't good just if it produces more utility than disutility. The policy is supposed to maximize utility. So we want to supply doctors to Mississippi. One way to do that might be require that everyone who gets out of medical school goes to not just Mississippi, but underserved areas. And it might be a good idea. There might be an even better idea that wouldn't involve pushing them in that direction, like maybe establishing more medical schools and having more positions for people to be doctors, whereas now the AMA limits that. But if you stipulate against some of my instincts that the only way to maximize utility is to take away some people's liberty for the sake of others, yeah, I don't think I have a problem. So I know, I live in Maine. Maine is a rural state. I know a lot of gun owners. And they're not murderers yet, anyway. I mean, they're nice guys. They are mainly guys, some women. They believe very strongly in their right to have a gun. They mainly have hunting guns. And when you talk about limiting gun ownership, they feel that their liberty is being taken away for the sake of someone else. That is, they personally aren't going to kill anyone. Let's say that's true. You're limiting them because you don't want the bad guys to have guns who would kill someone. And I'm willing to say, against statistics, that they're right. That is, they're not going to hurt anyone. You're making them give up their guns to keep these other people from having guns, and I'm fine with that. Because what they're giving up, I don't think is that significant. I mean, so, I don't know. I realize people really like to hunt, or people who like to hunt really like to hunt. And maybe give them a gun for the month of November or something. But yeah, I don't have a problem with that. Gun violence is really bad. Hunting is nice, but not that nice. So yeah, give it up.
Any other? I think I will whisper from now. Any other questions? No. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
To have a drink in the lobby, and then for the register for the conference dinner. That's all. Okay, stop. See you tomorrow.
A lot of stuff, because if you keep talking, you'll lose it in clarity. So don't. I've done that teaching.